Hello everybody, my name is Claire and welcome to my YouTube channel. I chose this book, LGBTQ Youth and Education, Policies and Practices by Cris Mayo. And I loved it. 10 out of 10 would recommend. The author of this book is Cris Mayo.
Cris Mayo was the former head of the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies. They have multiple publications in queer studies, gender and sexuality studies, and philosophy of education. They are the director of the LGBTQ Plus Center at West Virginia University, and they're a professor in women and gender studies.
So, according to Cris, this book is perfect for educators K through 12, and I agree. This book is extremely helpful by first explaining gender and sexuality from the bottom up. 1, the science behind it, as well as 2, social pressures behind it. So, the organization of this book was split into 6 different chapters, starting with explaining why LGBTQ youth in schools need support and how to provide that support and why students deserve that support. So, first up is the intro. That reminds educators of their duty to teach students in a safe and non-biased manner. It also prepares teachers to be advocates for students in the LGBTQ plus communities. For an example, speaking out against hate speech like "that's gay." Some teachers have reported that they feel if they become an ally, they may also get the finger pointed at them and be discriminated against and possibly fired. So this book helps educators understand that fear is not only salient in educators who are adults and autonomous in their own lives, but even more salient in their students' lives who are potentially under the control of their parents and their teachers, staff, adults, until they're 18 or until they're graduated. Chapter 1 offers background on historical LGBTQ movements and how they relate to the school environment, specifically K through 12. One example they used in the book was the Stonewall Riot. Say Chapter 2 is the most helpful for beginners. It breaks down societal norms like heterosexism and heteronormativity and the gender binary, as well as it makes salient the threat to women in society around sexuality and violence, and the danger to men in society around the idea that I know is becoming even bigger and talking about a lot, hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity. And then lastly, touches on the idea of sexual normalcy. Chapter 3 really was sad. I had to take a break when I was reading it because it covers school-related challenges. So the challenges that LGBTQ youth are actively facing in their schools. It mentioned bullying as this blanket term for any hardships that LGBTQ youth receive, especially from peers, but Cris does a really good job of explaining that bullying is extremely different than discrimination, and bullying to cover up a full community and the injustices that happen to that community when they're supposed to be in a safe space is minimalizing the experiences and the violence that LGBTQ youth have faced. In this chapter, Cris touches on the that's gay policy and actually talks about how that can make LGBTQ plus individuals more invisible, just because when you completely take away the word gay, whether the students can use that in a communicative context or a bullying context, whatever you do, if you take it away completely, you're taking away somebody's identity marker. Like if you don't let the school talk about that word or that word be said, you're silencing part of somebody's identity, whether or not you agree with it. This chapter brought up the past court cases of same-sex couples trying to bring their partner to prom or wearing the wrong or opposite sexed outfit so they weren't going to be accepted into the prom. The chapter was a little bit sad, but it absolutely outlines the pains and violences that these students have endured from administrators, teachers, and sometimes their legal system. I loved chapter 4. I think chapter 4 is the most useful chapter for any educator. Cris uses a very pedagogical strategy and curricular goals to evaluate the impacts of homophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, and classism to challenge society and give voices to those who have been silenced. So this chapter does a really good job of outlining why a good teacher advocates for their students, no matter what their beliefs, no matter how the student is being treated in not only the school society, but a larger society. And I think that that's so important. You elected yourself to be a teacher, to be an educator, to be a protector of students and their identity markers. I think it's only right to educate yourself and become an ally, if not stand with that student. In this chapter, Cris breaks down what he means by critically analyzing LGBTQ pedagogy. So one example is zero tolerance and exacerbating distance. This punishes the offender. However, the student does not learn from their punishment. Punitive does not equal understanding the experiences of genders and sexualities different than yours. Cris suggests instead holding LGBTQ workshops for staff, introducing brave spaces instead of safe spaces, because a safe space often provides a safe space for homophobic, racist, sexist comments to be made. When a brave space, the idea is to switch that space to a space where someone that has a silenced voice, has felt oppression, has felt different than societal norms, can feel brave enough to speak up. And I think that that honors the voices of students in the minority. And lastly, Cris suggests working with families, because students of LGBTQ plus communities often come from families that have some understanding or background knowledge, or could offer some sort of support to those students. Chapter 5 goes one step further, and this is the chapter where teachers can actually support for LGBTQ youth in their schools. This chapter has creative ideas for extracurricular activities, such as gay-straight alliance associations at the school, attempts to restrict bullying, a day of silence to understand students that have lost their lives due to an identity marker. Chapter 6 is a great wrap-up. It ties in how are teachers going to apply this in actual practice. And he defined queer as seeing from an angle or bending social norms. I thought that was great. And Cris goes on to say that as educators, we know how to critically think, and we're challenging our students to critically think every day in our classrooms. So educating your students of LGBTQ plus issues is going to only strengthen their ability to critically think, which is to set aside their prior understandings of concepts to instead stop and think from a new perspective. And that's exactly what we want our students doing. We want to be graduating these beautiful souls who understand other human beings, because we're social creatures. And the only way that we are going to have a successful society is understanding how our students are also social beings and how they deserve autonomy over their own markers. So overall, you guys can tell that I highly, highly, highly think of this book. But there are a few things that I would say could get in the way for a couple educators. Now, one is the cover. It is LGBTQ in big rainbow letters. I love that. That's what drew me to this book. But I already belong to the community. I'm already comfortable and have the prior knowledge to know that this book was going to be something I could pick up and be non-threatening. However, I think for an educator that might not have as much background and they were looking for something that was just like a small little manual to really help them out, they might see this and be too afraid to pick it up. But I just would suggest, please pick it up. Do not be afraid of the stigma, because I can guarantee if you're afraid of the stigma, your students are more afraid. For some adults, I think that might be a barrier to using this book as a tool. Now, what do I love about this book? It starts with the definitions and problems that students are currently and have historically faced because they identify as a marker in this community. Cris does a great job of, like I said in chapter 4, explaining in detail ways that educators can create brave spaces, create spaces where their students feel safe, as well as creating spaces where students can work on their history skills like critical thinking. It does not just have to be about sexuality. This is about human beings and being social and building relationships with your students, within your students, and within that school community. So this book does not only justice for the LGBTQ plus students in the school, this book would definitely benefit every human being within the school walls. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this review was helpful to you. I hope you pick up this book by Cris Mayo. Give it a read. Have it on your shelves. Share it with other educators, because every student deserves to be treated the way that Cris lays out in this book. And they're already struggling in a society that places norms on them. Schools should not just continue to exacerbate those norms.